On March 14, 2006, a 58-year-old farmer named Dale Peterson stood in the parts department of Northfield Case IH in Redwood Falls, Minnesota. He held a broken hydraulic control valve from his 1994 Case IH 7240. The part had failed during spring field work. The tractor was parked 20 miles away with a chisel plow still attached. The parts manager, a man Dale had known for 16 years, looked at the part number and typed it into his computer. He quoted $850 for a new OEM replacement. Dale asked if they could source a used valve from a salvage yard. The parts manager said no. Company policy had changed. New parts only. No exceptions. Dale left without the part. That decision, made by someone who didn't own the dealership and didn't make the policy, set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Within 14 months, 47 farmers would leave Northfield Case IH. Some of them had bought equipment there for 30 years. Some had fathers who'd bought equipment there before that. By November 2009, the dealership would close. The building would sit empty for 4 years before a farm supply store moved in. This is a story about a parts policy, but it's also a story about what happens when loyalty moves in two directions for decades and then stops moving in one. If you value stories that examine the long consequences of equipment decisions, the tension between corporate policy and rural relationships, and the ways dealerships shaped farming communities across generations, this channel preserves that perspective. These stories aren't meant to argue or advocate. They're meant to reflect what happened when choices were made under pressure, and time revealed what those choices actually cost. Subscribe if that matters to you. We'll continue. Dale Peterson had farmed 640 acres of corn and soybeans near Morgan, Minnesota since 1979. His father had farmed 320 of those acres before him. Dale bought his first Case IH tractor, a 5130, from Northfield Case IH in 1987. He paid cash. He bought a second one, a 7130, in 1991. He financed that one over 4 years and paid it off early. In 1998, he bought the 7240. It was used, 3 years old with 1,200 hours. He paid $68,000. The dealership serviced it twice a year. Dale did the rest himself. He kept maintenance records in a 3-ring binder in his shop. Oil changes, filter replacements, grease intervals. He wrote everything down in pencil. The 7240 was not his favorite tractor. It was louder than the 7130 had been. The cab door didn't seal right in cold weather, but it pulled the chisel plow without complaint and started in January. That mattered more than comfort. By 2006, the tractor had 4,800 hours. Dale had replaced the clutch once and the alternator twice. He had no plans to trade it. He intended to run it until something expensive broke, and then he'd decide. On March 12, 2006, he was chiseling a field east of his farmstead. The hydraulic control valve that managed the plow's lift system seized mid-row. The plow dropped. Dale shut the tractor down and walked back to the shop. He pulled the valve the next morning. It was a known weak point on the 7240. He'd heard other farmers talk about it at the co-op. He drove to Northfield Case IH on March 14th, expecting to either buy a new part or have them order a rebuilt one. He did not expect to be told that used parts were no longer an option. The parts manager, a man named Ron Eklund, had worked at the dealership since 1989. He had sold Dale parts for 17 years. He explained the new policy carefully. Corporate had decided that sourcing used or salvage parts created liability issues. If a used part failed and caused equipment damage, the dealership could be held responsible. The policy was clear: OEM parts only, sold at list price. Dale asked if Ron agreed with the policy. Ron said it didn't matter whether he agreed. Dale asked how long the policy had been in place. Ron said 6 weeks. Dale thanked him and left. He drove to a farm auction near Marshall, Minnesota 3 days later. A retired farmer was selling out. There were 2 Case IH tractors in the sale, a 7110 and a 7220. Both were parts machines. The 7220 had a burnt transmission. The hydraulic valve Dale needed was still intact. He bought the valve for $80. He installed it himself that evening. The tractor ran. He told his neighbor about the parts policy the next week. The neighbor told someone at church. That person told someone at the feed mill. Within a month, 15 farmers in Redwood and Renville counties knew that Northfield Case IH wouldn't source used parts anymore. Some of them didn't care. They bought new equipment on lease cycles and never kept a tractor long enough to need salvage parts. But others, the ones running equipment from the 1980s and 1990s, the ones farming 400 or 600 or 800 acres without outside income, they paid attention. In April 2006, a farmer named Lloyd Christensen called Northfield Case IH about a transmission seal for his 1989 Case IH 7140. The parts manager quoted $420 for the OEM seal. Lloyd asked if they could get a rebuilt seal from a supplier in Iowa he'd used before. Ron said no. Company policy. Lloyd drove to the supplier in Iowa himself. He bought the seal for $95. He also bought 2 hydraulic hoses and a set of filters. He didn't go back to Northfield Case IH. In June, a farmer named Victor Haugen needed a starter solenoid for a 1995 Case IH MX120. Northfield quoted $285. A dealership in Wilmar, 50 miles east, quoted $110 for a used part pulled from a trade-in. Victor drove to Wilmar. He also asked about a planner he'd been considering. The Wilmar dealership gave him a quote. It was $1,200 less than Northfield's price on the same unit. Victor bought the planner in Wilmar. In August, a farmer named Eugene Strom brought his 1992 Case IH 7120 to Northfield for a hydraulic pump repair. The service department diagnosed the problem and said the pump needed to be replaced. The new pump cost $2,340. Eugene asked if they could rebuild the existing pump. The service manager said they didn't do rebuilds anymore. Policy had changed. Eugene took the tractor home. He pulled the pump himself and sent it to a rebuilder in South Dakota. The rebuild cost $680. It took 3 weeks. Eugene lost time, but he saved $1,660. He also stopped recommending Northfield Case IH to other farmers. By September 2006, the dealership's parts revenue had dropped 14% compared to the previous year. The service department's hours were down 11%. The general manager, a man named Curtis Oberg, who had run the dealership since 1994, called a staff meeting. He asked Ron Eklund why parts sales were declining. Ron said the new policy was driving customers away. Curtis said the policy came from corporate. It wasn't optional. Liability insurance required it. If they sold a used part and it caused a failure, the dealership could be sued. Corporate had made that clear. Ron said farmers didn't care about corporate liability. They cared about keeping equipment running without going broke. Curtis said farmers would adjust. They always did, but they didn't adjust the way Curtis expected. In October 2006, a farmer named Dennis Erickson needed a fuel injection pump for his 1988 Case IH 1896. Northfield quoted $3,100 for a new pump. Dennis knew a man in North Dakota who rebuilt injection pumps for older equipment. He shipped the pump there. The rebuild cost $840. Dennis had bought 4 tractors from Northfield Case IH between 1986 and 2001. He had never considered going anywhere else. His father had bought equipment there in the 1970s. But after the fuel pump experience, Dennis started comparing prices with other dealerships. In November, he bought a used Case IH disc harrow from a dealer in Hutchinson. Northfield had the same model. Dennis didn't call them. In January 2007, a cold snap hit southwestern Minnesota. Temperatures dropped to 18 below zero. A farmer named Marvin Schultz couldn't start his 1991 Case IH 7130. He suspected the glow plug relay. He called Northfield Case IH. They quoted $260 for a new relay. Marvin asked if they had a used one. The parts manager said no. Marvin called a salvage yard near Mankato. They had 3 7130s in the yard. He drove there in a blizzard. He pulled the relay himself in the cold. It cost $35. The tractor started the next morning. Marvin didn't call Northfield Case IH again that year. By March 2007, 1 year after Dale Peterson's hydraulic valve incident, 23 farmers had reduced or stopped their parts purchases at Northfield Case IH. Most of them didn't announce it. They just quietly started buying parts somewhere else. Some used salvage yards, some used online suppliers, some drove to other dealerships. The dealership's parts sales dropped 22% year over year. Service hours dropped 16%. New equipment sales dropped 9%. Curtis Oberg didn't connect the parts policy to the sales decline at first. He thought the farm economy was softening. Corn prices were down from the previous year. Land rents were rising. He assumed farmers were tightening budgets. But in April 2007, something happened that made the connection clear. A farmer named Kenneth Arndt came to the dealership to look at a new Case IH Magnum 215. Kenneth farmed 1,100 acres and ran a custom baling operation. He'd bought 6 tractors from Northfield since 1983. He was exactly the kind of customer the dealership needed. Kenneth spent 2 hours looking at the Magnum. He asked about financing. He asked about trade-in value on his current tractor. Curtis put together a proposal. The numbers worked. Then Kenneth asked about parts availability. He asked if the dealership still refused to source used parts. Curtis said that was correct. Corporate policy required new OEM parts only. Kenneth thanked him and left. 3 weeks later, he bought a Magnum 215 from the Wilmar dealership. He also moved his parts account there. Curtis called him and asked why. Kenneth said he couldn't commit to a dealership that wouldn't support older equipment. He had 3 tractors from the 1990s that would need parts for another 10 years. If Northfield wouldn't source used parts for those machines, he couldn't trust them long term. Curtis tried to explain the liability issue. Kenneth said he didn't care about corporate liability. He cared about keeping equipment running affordably. The call ended. Curtis called corporate the next day. He explained that the parts policy was costing the dealership customers. He asked if there was flexibility. Corporate said no. The policy was national. Liability insurance required it. Every dealership had to comply. Curtis asked what happened if customers left. Corporate said customers wouldn't leave over parts. They'd leave over service quality or price. But corporate was wrong. Between April and December 2007, 19 more farmers reduced or stopped doing business with Northfield Case IH. Some of them had been customers for 20 years. Some had been customers for 30. A farmer named Raymond Tollefson bought a used Case IH combine from an auction in Iowa instead of trading at Northfield. He said he didn't trust a dealership that wouldn't support equipment after the sale. A farmer named Gerald Swenson moved his service work to an independent mechanic in Olivia. He said the mechanic would install used parts without argument. A farmer named Arthur Lindstrom bought a planter from a dealership in Wilmar. He said Northfield had lost his confidence. By January 2008, the dealership's total revenue had dropped 31% compared to 2 years earlier. The staff had been reduced from 11 people to 7. Ron Eklund, the parts manager, had taken a pay cut to avoid being laid off. Curtis Oberg called another meeting. He said the dealership was in trouble. If revenue didn't improve, they'd have to consider closing. Ron asked if corporate would reconsider the parts policy. Curtis said he'd asked 3 times. The answer was always no. In March 2008, a farmer named Stanley Hoffman came to the dealership. He needed a steering cylinder for his 1986 Case IH 1896. Northfield quoted $980 for a new cylinder. Stanley asked if they could source a used one. Ron said no. Policy hadn't changed. Stanley left. He found a used cylinder at a salvage yard in South Dakota for $175. He also found a set of wheel bearings and 2 hydraulic hoses he needed. Total cost $340. He told 5 other farmers about the experience. 3 of them had already stopped using Northfield. 2 hadn't. After hearing Stanley's story, both of them started looking elsewhere for parts. By June 2008, 42 farmers had reduced or eliminated their business with Northfield Case IH. The dealership's parts revenue had dropped 43% since 2005. Service revenue was down 38%. New equipment sales were down 22%. Curtis Oberg met with his accountant. The dealership was losing money. The building lease was $9,400 per month. Payroll was $31,000 per month. Revenue wasn't covering expenses. The accountant asked how long Curtis could operate at a loss. Curtis said maybe 6 months. After that, he'd have to close. In September 2008, the financial crisis hit. Credit tightened. Farm equipment sales slowed nationally. Dealerships across the Midwest started struggling. Northfield Case IH wasn't unique in facing financial pressure. But the parts policy had already weakened the business before the crisis arrived. In November 2008, a farmer named Thomas Rydberg came to the dealership. He'd been a customer since 1981. He farmed 480 acres and ran two Case IH tractors, a 1987 7130 and a 1994 7240. He needed a hydraulic pump for the 7240. Northfield quoted $2,150 for a new pump. Thomas asked if they could source a used one. Ron said no. Thomas asked if Ron thought the policy made sense. Ron said it didn't matter what he thought. The policy came from corporate. Thomas said corporate didn't farm. Corporate didn't fix tractors in February. Corporate didn't know what it cost to keep equipment running past 10 years. Ron agreed. But he said the policy wasn't going to change. Thomas left. He bought a used pump from a dealership in North Dakota for $620. He also decided that when his tractors wore out, he wouldn't replace them with Case IH equipment. He'd look at other brands. He told his son the same thing. In February 2009, Curtis Oberg called corporate again. He said the dealership was going to close unless something changed. He asked if the parts policy could be modified. Not eliminated, but modified. Maybe allow used parts for equipment older than 15 years. Corporate said no. The policy was firm. If the dealership couldn't operate profitably under corporate guidelines, Curtis should consider selling the franchise. Curtis asked who would buy a failing dealership. Corporate didn't answer. In March 2009, Curtis laid off 3 more employees. That left 4 people: himself, Ron Eklund, 1 service technician, and 1 sales associate. In May 2009, 2 more farmers moved their business to other dealerships. One of them, a farmer named Howard Berglund, had bought equipment from Northfield since 1979. He told Curtis directly why he was leaving. He said the parts policy had broken the relationship. He said a dealership that wouldn't help him keep old equipment running wasn't a dealership he could trust with new equipment. Curtis tried to explain corporate's position. Howard said he didn't care about corporate. He cared about men he'd known for 30 years acting like they didn't know him. The conversation ended badly. In August 2009, Curtis stopped taking a salary. He paid his remaining employees and hoped revenue would improve. It didn't. In October 2009, he called corporate and said he was closing the dealership. Corporate asked if he'd tried cutting costs. Curtis said he'd cut everything he could. Corporate asked if he'd raised prices. Curtis said raising prices would drive away the few customers he had left. Corporate said they were sorry, but if the dealership couldn't operate profitably, closure was the best option. On November 18, 2009, Northfield Case IH closed. The inventory was sold to another dealership in South Dakota. The building was emptied. The sign came down. Ron Eklund moved to a dealership in Wilmar. Several of the farmers who'd left Northfield were already buying parts there. Ron helped them. He sourced used parts when he could. He said the Wilmar dealership didn't have the same corporate policy, or if they did, they ignored it. Curtis Oberg left the equipment business. He took a job managing a grain elevator in Marshall. He didn't talk about the dealership much. When people asked why it closed, he said the economy killed it. But that wasn't the whole truth. In 2011, a reporter from a farm publication interviewed Curtis for a story about rural dealership closures. Curtis was more honest. He said the parts policy had started the decline. The financial crisis finished it. But if the dealership had still been strong in 2008, it might have survived the crisis. The reporter asked if he thought corporate knew the policy was driving customers away. Curtis said corporate knew. They just didn't think it mattered enough to change. The reporter asked if Curtis would have done anything differently. Curtis said he would have fought harder against the policy. He would have explained to corporate more clearly that rural customers weren't the same as suburban customers. Rural customers kept equipment longer. They repaired instead of replaced. They needed dealerships that understood that. But corporate didn't understand, or didn't care to. Ron Eklund was also interviewed. He said the policy wasn't wrong because of the rule itself. It was wrong because it ignored relationships. He said farmers didn't just buy parts, they bought trust. When the dealership stopped offering used parts, it told farmers that corporate policy mattered more than 30 years of history. Ron said farmers heard that message clearly. In 2013, a farmer named Dale Peterson, the man whose hydraulic valve incident started the exodus, was asked if he thought the dealership's closure was connected to the parts policy. Dale said yes. He said the policy wasn't the only reason, but it was the first crack. He said once farmers started going elsewhere for parts, they started comparing prices on everything. They realized other dealerships were more flexible. They realized loyalty didn't have to be one-directional. Dale said he didn't celebrate the dealership closing. He said it was a loss for the community. But he also said the dealership made a choice. They chose corporate policy over relationships. The consequences followed. By 2015, 47 farmers who had done business with Northfield Case IH in 2005 had moved most or all of their equipment purchases to other dealerships. Some went to Wilmar, some went to Hutchinson, some went to Mankato. A few switched brands entirely. Not all of them left because of the parts policy. Some left because the dealership closed, but the majority left before it closed. They left because a $1,850 quote felt like a betrayal. They left because a policy made sense in a boardroom, but not in a shop. They left because a relationship that had lasted decades ended over a hydraulic valve. The building where Northfield Case IH operated sat empty until 2013. A farm supply store moved in. They sold fencing, livestock equipment, and animal feed. They also sold used tractor parts. Farmers came in regularly. In 2017, Ron Eklund retired from the Wilmar dealership. He was asked in a private conversation if he thought the parts policy had been the right decision. He said no. He said it made sense on paper. It protected the dealership from liability. It simplified inventory. It aligned with corporate goals. But it ignored the fact that farming isn't a business where relationships are optional. Farmers remember who helped them and who didn't. They remember who made life harder and who made it easier. Ron said the policy made life harder. And farmers didn't forget. In 2018, a farmer named Lloyd Christensen, one of the first to leave Northfield after the transmission seal incident, traded his 1989 Case IH 7140. He bought a newer Case IH tractor from the Wilmar dealership. The salesman asked why he'd stayed with Case IH after all the trouble. Lloyd said it wasn't the equipment he'd left, it was the dealership. In 2020, Curtis Oberg was asked, in a casual conversation at a retirement auction, if he thought the parts policy had been worth following. He said no. He said he'd followed it because corporate required it. But he should have refused. He should have told corporate that local knowledge mattered more than national policy. He should have risked the franchise. He said he didn't. And 47 customers left, and the dealership closed. Curtis said the policy didn't kill the dealership by itself, but it started something that couldn't be stopped. It turned trust into suspicion. It turned loyalty into comparison shopping. It turned relationships into transactions. And once that shift happened, there was no way back. In 2022, Dale Peterson sold his farm. His son didn't want to farm. Dale auctioned the equipment. The 1994 Case IH 7240, the tractor with the hydraulic valve that started everything, sold for $28,000. A young farmer from North Dakota bought it. He planned to use it on 400 acres of wheat ground. Dale watched the tractor leave on a flatbed trailer. He thought about the $850 part quote from 16 years earlier. He thought about the dealership that used to be 20 miles away. He thought about Ron Eklund, who'd always helped until corporate said he couldn't. Dale didn't blame Ron. He didn't even blame Curtis. He blamed a policy that treated farmers like customers instead of neighbors. He blamed a system that valued short-term liability protection over long-term relationships. He said the equipment still worked. The valve he'd installed in 2006 was still functioning in 2022. 16 years, $80, installed in an evening. He said the dealership that wouldn't source that part closed after 3 years. He said that told him everything he needed to know about the cost of policy versus the cost of parts. The 7240 rolled down the highway toward North Dakota. Dale went back inside. The auction continued. Somewhere in Minnesota, the building that used to house Northfield Case IH still stands. The farm supply store is still there. Farmers still come in for parts, new ones and used ones. And somewhere in files that nobody looks at anymore, there's a corporate memo from 2006 explaining why dealerships should only sell new OEM parts. The memo is correct about liability, it's correct about inventory, it's correct about efficiency, but it doesn't mention the 47 farmers, it doesn't mention the relationships, it doesn't mention what happens when policy meets people who've been doing business the same way for 30 years. It just explains the rule and assumes compliance. The dealership complied and closed. The farmers adapted and left. And a hydraulic valve that cost $80 became a decision that defined 14 months, 47 customers, and the end of a business that had been part of a community since 1971. Not because the policy was cruel, but because it was inflexible. And in farming, inflexibility is a kind of cruelty all its own.